a greenhouse, whether it's small or large, or even just a mini greenhouse or even a cloche or a cold frame, is one of the best ways of extending your flower garden. It's Alexandra here from the Middle Sized Garden YouTube channel and blog, and I'm here at the beautiful Westdean Gardens with Tom Brown, who has just published a book called The Greenhouse Book, published by DK. And although the greenhouses here at Westdean are absolutely beautiful and are giving me serious greenhouse envy, the greenhouses, cloches and cold frames in the book are all in Tom's own middle-sized garden. So they're much smaller, they're like a hobby greenhouse. So he's going to tell us what we need to know if we want to choose and use a greenhouse to make our garden season last longer. So Tom, what would you say is the biggest mistake that people make when they're either choosing or using a greenhouse?
I think sort of getting the right size for you, and I think almost you want to have the biggest greenhouse that your space will reasonably allow, and not see it as a functional space necessarily, but integrate it into your garden as part of the design, because this is a space that you are in control of. You're the boss. You can behave and do what you want in this space, and it needs to be accessible, particularly in the winter. So don't try and hide a greenhouse down the end of the garden, and find one that you can do as much gardening in as possible.
Now there's lots about vegetable gardening and grow your own in greenhouses in your book, The Greenhouse Book, but I tend to stick to the flower gardening side, and I think people don't quite realise how much greenhouses can add to that side. So what would you say, if you're going to just try and improve your flower garden and grow flowers, what would you say are the most important things you need to remember about working in a greenhouse?
Something that really comes to mind with cut flowers is the benefits of glass or plastic over the winter months. So the wet and the cold are the biggest killers and the biggest problems for gardeners. So growing things in a greenhouse gives you a bit of protection from both of those. So if you think about things like tulips or anemones or ranunculus, they will get easily damaged by a late frost or those particularly perilous winter conditions. So having them under glass, you can control all of those different things. So you can keep them on the dry side to keep them preventing from rotting. You can feed them when they start to come into growth, and those blooms are immaculate. So even a little bowl of hyacinths that you can bring on in a greenhouse and then bring into the living room or the kitchen once they're in flower is a really good way to utilise that greenhouse in the winter months. And one of my biggest bugbears is people see the greenhouse as a storage facility. It's almost like the TARDIS that things keep going into over the winter, barbecues and all that sort of stuff. Whereas actually they're a really exciting way to continue gardening through those really cold and wet months. You put the radio on, take a cup of tea in there, it could be a really great space to spend some time.
So when you're gardening in the winter in a greenhouse, what would you actually be doing? Because in fact, most flowers won't actually flower, will they? So what would you be doing?
It's all about sort of building the plant up, ready for its moment to shine in the limelight, if you like. So you are almost keeping everything in suspended animation over the winter. The biggest issue is not overwatering. As gardeners, and I'm guilty of this as well, I'm a terrific overwaterer, so I really have to sort of control myself during the winter. But we always think of watering as love, and we want to give our plants lots of love. Here's lots of water because I love you so very much. But actually what we're doing is adding water to a plant that can't process that moisture. When a plant's actively growing, it can absorb the moisture and it disappears through transpiration, but in the winter it's not really growing. So all that water does is starts to create these anaerobic conditions, which leads to root rot. So when we come to the spring, the plant's in quite a bad way. So watering isn't love. And also daylight and day length are really compromised during the winter. So under glass, you make the most of that. And also by cleaning your glass in the autumn and keeping it clean through the winter, you're allowing as much light into that greenhouse to make those seedlings or plants grow to the biggest potential. And we all have leggy seedlings where we exclude light, get that grime off the glass and make every sort of way to make the most of every square inch of light that comes through.
You've mentioned both glass and polycarbonate.
Yeah.
What are the pros and cons between them?
I think that with glass it tends to be more as an aesthetic choice. I think glass tends to look a little bit more beautiful. You tend to get more light transmission through glass than you do polycarbonate. But there are also practical implications as well. If you have children or pets and maybe glass isn't the safest option, then polycarbonate can work equally as well. I find that glass is quite available. Building these greenhouses, I'm not ashamed to say that I did break a few panes of glass. and I got to know a local glazing company very well, and I could go down and pick up a replacement pane of glass quite easily. So I found them very easy to sort of get my hands on, which I think most people up and down the country, if you can find a good glazing firm for horticultural glass, they'll probably be a good friend of yours by the time you finish building these things.
So in fact the polycarbonate won't break as often, but if it does break it'll be more difficult to repair.
Yes, and also sort of cut to size as well, and especially if you're buying a second-hand greenhouse, and I think that's the reality for most people, to sort of buy a brand new greenhouse off the peg certainly isn't something that I would necessarily think was feasible for myself. So looking on Facebook Marketplace or online and picking up a second-hand greenhouse where you'll probably find that there are a few panes missing in the first place, or you're going to lose a few in transit, I think glass is a much more sort of practical option in terms of replacement.
So what about mini or lean-to greenhouses? They're like these little sets of shelves that you have and you put them against the wall. I mean, are those worthwhile?
Very much so. I think with this book I wanted to explore the world of greenhouses with every nook and cranny in the subject. Everything from cold frames to lean-to greenhouses, and I bought a lean-to greenhouse, quite a modest price, with shelving, and it went up against the south-facing wall on the house. And everything that I did in the big greenhouse I could do in the small greenhouse. So it was great for seedlings. I even had a small terracotta candle heater at the bottom to keep the frost off of some of the succulents in the winter. And then in the summer I grew my beefsteak tomatoes in it because all the shelves can collapse. So I think there's a lot of pleasure that can be had from a lean-to greenhouse, and I don't see any reason why people should be limited with one of those.
So one of the questions people ask quite a lot is what flowers grow best in a greenhouse?
The lovely thing about glass is that it preserves the flowers, so they're pretty pristine, so you're not going to get them wet and cold and marked. You can also grow them in pots and raise them off the floor, so some of those miniature daffodils that you wouldn't necessarily be able to appreciate right on the ground come up more to eye height. But some of my absolute favourite flowers to grow would be stocks, which are easy to grow from seed. They can flower in about 15 weeks, and quite often you grow them over the winter and keep them like a small cabbage, and then they start to extend around this time of year, sort of April time. Ranunculus has been so good for me over the last few years. They love bright, sunny conditions with a good bit of air movement, and florists and anemones as well are really great, particularly over the winter. And if you like tulips, you can get some large grow bags, some open grow bags, which I used in the book, and we grow a lot of peony tulips in those, so they come particularly earlier than they would do in the garden. So where we talk about extending the season, greenhouses give you ability to grow flowers a month, 6 weeks earlier than they would do in the garden, so they're that much more special.
That makes me think cut flowers. Can you grow cut flowers in a greenhouse?
You very much can, and I think they sort of fill the gap. So with a lot of crops that we associate with the summer in a greenhouse are our tomatoes, sweet potatoes, aubergine, chilies, that wouldn't find a greenhouse very hospitable during the winter, particularly an unheated one. And I was very conscious not to heat my greenhouse, because if a lot of people are renting or haven't got the funds to sort of dig up the lawn and put cables to their greenhouses, let's think about portable heaters like candles and terracotta. So a lot of this was unheated glass, really.
I gather you've been growing cut flowers in your own greenhouse at home.
Yes, so we've been growing lots of ranunculus and floris anemones, which I've got with me today to show you, but they do fit that gap where you haven't got the sort of edible crops, because the glass house is cool and it's bright, but it's not necessarily warm. So things like those anemones and ranunculus, they don't need the heat, they just need protection from the wet. So they can fill your greenhouse before all of those traditional summer crops start to come through. And actually a greenhouse can be too hot for most flowers in the summer. I found that zinnias and some tagetes can cope with that sort of heat, but mostly in the winter you're better off with cut flowers and some hardy herbs like parsley and a bit of mint to make winter salads, to make the most of those cool, bright conditions, but flowers are very well suited to that. What you find is as we go into the winter and the temperatures drop a bit and it gets a bit darker, they tend to grow a lot slower, but they're still growing. But as soon as you start to come into the warmer weather, they've had that much sort of build-up of root system that they grow very, very quickly. But yes, things like mint, you can grow in a greenhouse over the winter months, so you get a little bit for your tea, and then it's got a head start in the spring. Things like parsley, coriander, just going to a supermarket and pulling apart a coriander plant and planting it in a pot in an unheated greenhouse will give you much earlier herbs. And yes, mustards, some of the hardy lettuce, all those sorts of things just tend to, it's almost like you're pressing the pause button in the greenhouse over the winter. You're not saying to these plants, you must grow. It's like stay alive until conditions become a bit more favourable, and then they can grow a little bit faster than their counterparts outside.
So you don't necessarily get them all through the winter to eat, but you get them earlier.
You get them earlier, and if you can get them established in the autumn, so they're a reasonable size before they go into the winter, you might be able to get a few harvests, but you won't get the replacement foliage that you would do when those warmer temperatures arrive.
But of course, I've got diverted onto vegetables.
Let's go back, go back.
Back to plants, back to flowers. Are there any flowers or flowering plants that I should not put in a greenhouse?
I would say any plant that you would associate with the garden in the spring will be able to cope with being grown in a greenhouse over the winter months to give you an earlier flowering display. Because if you're talking about an unheated greenhouse, it's not unseasonable. You're mostly protecting it from the winter wet. So some of the crocus, daffodils, hyacinths in a pot in the greenhouse tend to come through much more immaculately because they've not got that overhead rain to deal with. So I would say most things that are hardy outside in the garden could be grown in a greenhouse because you're not necessarily exposing them to high temperatures, you're just protecting them from the worst of the weather.
So how do you stop a greenhouse from overheating in the summer?
The other extreme, where you're trying to protect plants, you've got the cold and the wet in the winter, but then you've got the ferocious heat in the summer. And you want to try and bring those extremes back into the centre a little bit. So with summer greenhouses, it's about shading, whether that's with a big net over the side or and the apex, or whether it's with a chalk-based paint. You're trying to reduce the glare and the heat within it. Ventilation is one of those tricks in a greenhouse that you sort of develop over time. And I would never want people to dampen down their instincts when they're in a greenhouse. If it feels too warm, then it probably is, and you want to dial up the ventilation. So good ventilation and shading, and damping down is another way just to sort of bring the temperature down. There's a couple of pictures of me there sloshing watering cans of water around in the summer. That just brings the humidity up, which helps with pests such as red spider mite, but also just drops the temperature down a little bit as well. And you're right, a big part of greenhouse growing in the summer is managing those extreme temperatures.
Lots of people don't really think about painting their glass greenhouses and then wiping it off in the winter.
Yeah.
So is it practical? Is it easy? How do you do it?
It does work. I'm not going to sit here smugly and say, oh, it's ever so easy, because I've had some interesting times with the paint. So everything to do with the book I actually did at home, and there's nothing in there that wasn't done. And when you've got a photographer looking at you painting and you're trying to be cool and calm and collected, and with these big greenhouses we tend to use a roller. So I used a roller at home with the smaller greenhouses, and it made a right mess. It looked terrible. So what I would say is a large painting brush or paintbrush would work really well. And you don't necessarily have to achieve the finish in the first coat. Depending on the kind of product that you use will depend on the thickness and how much it covers, but I had to go over it a couple of times. So the idea of me having this roller that would just glide up the glass and have this perfect shot wasn't really the case at all. So it took a couple of coats to give me the effect. And with this paint, again, you are assessing it all the time, which is what you're doing in a greenhouse, whether it's watering, ventilating, or the paint on the edge. Sometimes it needs topping up. So in a particularly high part of the summer, if we've had a little bit of rain, some of that paint can come away. So you just need to top it up to make sure you're giving as much protection and excluding some of that light as much as you can. And then as soon as you start to lose the light, that's when it comes off. And it does take a little bit of elbow grease and a scrubbing brush and a sponge to actually get it off.
And some kind of washing up liquid or anything, or is it just literally water and elbow grease?
Pretty much water and elbow grease, really. I always think a little dash of washing up liquid in the bucket makes me feel better, and I do often put a little squirt in there because it makes it feel cleaner. But yeah, you're right, mainly elbow grease. And what you'll find is when the rain starts to come in through the autumn and the winter, that will also help wash some of that off.
Pests and diseases, how can you keep them under control?
Pests and diseases are an ongoing issue. And I think having a little bit of everything in a greenhouse helps, because you've not got that monoculture where it's just a magnet for pests. The approach is quite proactive and little and often. If you allow pest levels to build up in a greenhouse, it's very difficult to then get them under control. But one of the joys of a greenhouse at home is that you're pottering around and you're just spending the time monitoring your plants and getting to know them quite well. If you start to see an outbreak of aphids or red spider mite, if you can deal with them by either physically removing them, or I use a lot of that SB plant Invigorator, which is an oil-based spray, you've got more chance of keeping them under control. I think in the old days with greenhouse gardening, I love the quote of if it flies, it dies. You know, they don't want anything to live in this space, it's incredibly sterile. With a modern approach to greenhouses where we're using integrated pest management and biological controls, you need a few pests within the environment to sustain the predators. So it's a much more balanced approach rather than having this sterile environment where we feel that any other sort of sign of life apart from the plants that we're growing is bad. Even things like mildew or a little bit of dieback isn't necessarily the end of the world. If you're still getting those flowers or those crops from it, does it matter?
Are there any space-saving tips for smaller greenhouses?
I think shelves can work really well to sort of save space. If you are using shelving, be very conscious of the light levels at different points. You want as much light to come into those shelves as possible, particularly with things like seedlings. Otherwise you find they'll grow off to an angle to try and find the light. And I think you can cram a greenhouse as long as you've got enough room to be able to sort of walk like a crab through the greenhouses to get to everything. You can really pack it, and you'll find that in a greenhouse the amount of plants that you've got in there will ebb and flow. So at some times of the year you can't move in there, but then other times of year everything sort of opens up a little bit. And keeping it tidy, trying to make it as safe as possible. So if you've got clutter everywhere, that's A, valuable space, but B, it's quite unsafe as well. So try to be as efficient as you can with your space.
Can I combine a greenhouse with a potting bench or seating area?
So with the greenhouse at home, I've got a plastic tray that sits on the shelf, which is my sort of mobile potting bench, which can be then taken off in times of sort of need where I've got seedlings everywhere. To enjoy the garden in the winter can be quite challenging, but you can go and sit in a greenhouse with a cup of tea and the radio on, and it can be quite a pleasant place to be. I think we're sort of creatures that love reasonable light levels, and you can get that in a greenhouse. So actually a table and chairs was one of the things that inhabited my greenhouse for the winter. I tended to double that up as a bit of a potting space as well. So if I was staking my hyacinths in pots with some hazel twigs, I'd sit at the table and do that rather than at a potting bench. And so I think the seating area, I would definitely think about using your greenhouse as a nice space to sit in the winter. Potting benches, if they can be movable, that really helps, but there's no reason why it can't involve all of them. Initially, I was quite concerned about going into that kind of domestic scale and trying to write 50,000 words about greenhouse growing. And one of the bits of advice that a friend gave me was, well, how are you going to write a whole book on a relatively small space? People write a book about a garden, which you can do quite a lot in. And I think what I tried to do was cover every aspect, as many aspects as I possibly could of greenhouse growing, whether that was growing citrus or cacti or pelargoniums, taking dahlia cuttings, chrysanthemum cuttings. How much you can do in a greenhouse in 1 year, I suppose, was daunting, but looking back on it now, I'm quite happy with everything that we managed to achieve. And then photograph. So it wasn't acceptable to have a crop failure on your peppers because Jason was coming to photograph them the next week, so they had to be ready, they had to be ripe.
As well as being head gardener at West Dean, Tom is known for his garden writing, and he's very good at making things very clear, very relatable, easy to follow. And so if you want to have a stunning herbaceous border, don't miss the next video coming up next with Tom's 12 tips for a stunning border. And thank you for watching. Goodbye.